My name is Claire Donovan, and I'm 34 years old. For nearly 4 years, every extra dollar I earned disappeared into an account nobody knew about except me. I skipped vacations with coworkers, drove the same aging SUV long after it should have been replaced, packed lunches instead of eating out, and quietly accepted every overtime shift my hospital offered. Friends assumed I was saving for a dream home with my husband, Ethan. My in-laws assumed we were planning for children. Even Ethan believed I was simply being cautious with money because that's who I'd always been. The truth was much simpler. I wasn't saving for my future. I was rebuilding someone else's. My parents had lost everything when a fire tore through the small hardware store they had owned for almost 28 years. Insurance covered part of the damage, but not enough to reopen. And by the time legal fees and debt collectors finished circling, they were forced to sell the family house where I had grown up. They never complained. They rented a tiny apartment overlooking a busy highway, pretending the constant traffic noise reminded them of being close to the city instead of admitting they missed the quiet neighborhood they'd spent 3 decades calling home. Every time I visited, my mother insisted they were perfectly happy. Every time I left, I caught my father standing on the balcony staring toward the distant hills where our old neighborhood used to be. That image stayed with me long after every visit ended. So when I found a restored farmhouse sitting on 5 peaceful acres just outside town, complete with a vegetable garden, a red barn, and the wraparound porch my mother had always dreamed about, I knew exactly where every dollar I'd been saving belonged. It cost almost everything I had. I emptied my savings, sold several investments, and signed papers that left me with a mortgage payment larger than my own apartment rent. I never hesitated. Some purchases aren't expenses. They're thank you letters written with deeds instead of words. The closing happened 6 weeks before my parents' 35th wedding anniversary, and I kept the entire thing secret except from my younger sister, Hannah, who helped furnish the house while I worked double shifts. We planned every detail ourselves. Family photographs filled the hallway. Fresh flowers waited in every room. My mother's favorite yellow curtains hung in the kitchen windows, and my father found an antique rocking chair nearly identical to the one his grandfather used to own. We wanted them to feel as though the house had been waiting for them all along. Ethan offered to help during the final weekend before the surprise, explaining that his parents, Richard and Monica Bennett, had volunteered to meet the furniture deliveries while we handled transportation. At the time, it sounded generous. Looking back, I should have recognized it for what it really was. Monica. Bennett had never hidden her opinion of my family. She liked expensive neighborhoods, private clubs, and conversations where people casually mentioned vacation homes. My parents, according to her, lacked ambition because they had spent their lives serving customers instead of climbing corporate ladders. She often smiled while saying things that somehow managed to leave bruises nobody else could see. She once complimented my mother's homemade pie by saying it tasted surprisingly good, considering that ingredients must have been inexpensive. She told Ethan more than once that marrying me had been admirable, because not everyone could overlook such different backgrounds. Ethan usually apologized afterward, promising he'd speak with her. And because he truly loved me, I always believed things would eventually improve. They never did. On the morning of the anniversary, I picked my parents up from the small hotel where Hannah had convinced them to stay overnight by pretending she'd won a promotional travel package. My mother wore the floral dress she'd saved for special occasions. My father had polished the same brown shoes he'd worn at my college graduation, almost 15 years earlier. During the drive, they teased each other about getting older, laughed over forgotten family vacations, and asked dozens of questions about the farmhouse they believed belonged to one of my coworkers who was considering selling it. My heart raced the closer we came, imagining the look on their faces when I finally handed them the keys. But as we turned onto the gravel driveway, excitement gave way to something colder. The flower baskets Hannah and I had hung beneath every porch window were gone. The welcome sign we'd painted together had disappeared. Expensive SUVs filled the driveway, none of which belonged to anyone I knew. Through the front windows, I could see unfamiliar curtains, different furniture, and strangers walking through. Rooms that should have been empty until my parents stepped inside. Before I could even stop the car completely, the front door swung open. Monica Bennett walked onto the porch wearing a silk blouse and holding a ring of keys that should never have been in her possession. She looked at my parents, as though they had wandered into a private country club without an invitation. My mother smiled politely, assuming there had been some misunderstanding. She had barely taken 2 steps toward the porch before Monica lifted one hand and pointed sharply back toward the driveway. "I'm sorry," she called loudly enough for neighboring properties to hear. "But this home isn't open for visitors. You'll need to leave." My mother stopped instantly. The smile vanished from her face as confusion settled in its place. My father looked from Monica to me, searching for an explanation I couldn't yet give him. I sat frozen, behind the steering wheel, staring at the keys hanging from Monica's fingers, realizing this wasn't an accident. Whatever had happened here had happened long before we arrived. I stepped out of the car before anyone else could speak, my pulse pounding so hard I could barely hear the gravel crunch beneath my shoes. "Monica," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "why do you have keys to my parents' house?" She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that always carried more arrogance than amusement. "Your parents' house?" she repeated, glancing at Richard, who appeared beside her with a smug smile. "Claire, Ethan told us you bought this property as an investment. We assumed you realized it would be far more suitable for us. After all, we're retired now, and we've earned something like this." My stomach dropped. I turned toward Ethan, who had just walked out from inside carrying a box of crystal glasses as though nothing about this scene was unusual. "Tell me she's lying," I whispered. He hesitated for only a second, but that second was enough to shatter every ounce of trust I had left. "Claire," he began carefully, "I was going to explain after today. My parents love the place, and honestly, your parents wouldn't know what to do with a property this large. They were happy in their apartment. My parents can actually appreciate it." My mother quietly lowered her eyes while my father placed one gentle hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her despite the humiliation spreading across his own face. Something inside me snapped. I reached into my purse, pulled out the folder containing every purchase document, and held it in front of Ethan. "Whose name is on the deed?" I asked. He looked confused. "Yours," he admitted. "Exactly, mine, not yours. Not your parents', mine." Monica folded her arms. "Don't be dramatic. Ethan is your husband. What's yours is his." I smiled for the first time that afternoon. And it wasn't a kind smile. Not this house. Their expressions changed instantly. Because before closing, my attorney insisted I purchase it through a family trust after the fire. Destroyed my parents' business. The deed belongs to the Donovan family trust. Ethan has no ownership, no legal access, and certainly no authority to hand over my property. Richard's confidence disappeared. Monica tightened her grip on the keys. I calmly pulled out my phone and called my attorney, who had been expecting my call after the surprise reveal. Within minutes, he confirmed over speakerphone that anyone occupying the property without my permission was trespassing. I then called the county sheriff. Ethan stepped closer, panic replacing confidence. "Claire, don't do this. We can work this out." I looked at him with tears in my eyes. "You already worked it out. You chose your parents over your wife." 20 minutes later, 2 deputies arrived. I showed them my identification, the trust documents, the closing paperwork, and the security system registration, all bearing my name. Monica tried insisting it had been a misunderstanding, but misunderstandings don't involve changing curtains, replacing furniture, removing decorations, and moving personal belongings into someone else's home. The deputies instructed Richard and Monica to gather everything they had brought and leave immediately. They argued until one deputy quietly informed them that refusing would result in criminal trespassing charges. Their confidence evaporated. As movers carried their belongings back into the SUVs, Ethan stood alone in the driveway, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. "Please," he said softly, "I made a mistake." I nodded. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." I handed him my wedding ring. "And now I've made mine." He watched silently as I walked away. Hannah arrived just then with the replacement flower baskets she had kept in her truck after noticing the originals missing earlier that morning. Together we rehung every basket, placed the welcome sign back beside the porch, and opened the front door once more. This time nothing stood in my parents' way. My mother stepped inside first, her hand covering her mouth as she recognized the photographs lining the hallway. She ran her fingers across the yellow kitchen curtains before breaking into quiet tears. My father walked slowly onto the back porch where the antique rocking chair waited, sat down, looked across the rolling fields, and smiled in a way I hadn't seen since before the fire. "Claire," he whispered, "this feels like home." I placed the keys into his hands. "It is home," I answered. "It's yours." Neither of my parents spoke for several seconds. Then my mother wrapped her arms around me so tightly I could hardly breathe while my father quietly wiped his eyes, pretending the evening breeze was to blame. A month later, I filed for divorce. Ethan apologized repeatedly, but apologies cannot rebuild. Trust once someone willingly hands away the future you sacrificed years to create. The court proceedings were straightforward because the trust protected every asset intended for my parents, exactly as my attorney had planned. Richard and Monica never contacted me again after being warned by their own lawyer that they had no legal claim to the property. My parents spent that first summer planting tomatoes, restoring the old barn, and inviting neighbors over for homemade lemonade on the wraparound porch. Every Sunday, Hannah and I joined them for dinner, watching the sunset paint the fields gold while my father rocked peacefully in his chair and my mother laughed louder than she had in years. People often ask whether buying that farmhouse was the biggest financial risk I ever took. I always tell them no. The biggest risk would have been believing that family is defined by marriage, certificates instead of sacrifice, loyalty and love. Houses can burn down, businesses can disappear overnight, money can vanish faster than anyone expects. But when the people who raised you spend their lives building yours, there comes a moment when you finally get the chance to build theirs in return. That anniversary wasn't remembered because of betrayal or legal papers. It became unforgettable because, after losing everything once, my parents walked through the front door of a home where nobody could ever make them feel unwelcome again.